views or approaches by Fidelity. I'm speaking as a private individual. And I also kind of live a double life, not something you hear very often in meetups, because at nights when I finish work, I'm a PhD student in Cambridge, and I'm reading for ethics and applications of artificial intelligence in financial services. So, it's the fun just never stops. It's like running a marathon, but at the speed of a sprint. And what I'm about to present to you right now is a combination of some of my professional and academic interests, but not directly related to Fidelity per se. So without further ado, let me just share my screen and we can get this show on the road. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm also an occasional blogger, so you've got my blog on the bottom and an email if you have any further questions. So before we go any further, as Leo mentioned, the idea is that I will introduce some topics and perhaps start from a business and compliance angle, whereas I think that Luca will get a little more technical in engineering. So that should be a pretty nice and logical flow, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have afterwards. So without further ado, and don't worry, I don't have many slides. I'm not a big fan of PowerPoint. So let's start a little bit with definitions. So you probably have a pretty good idea what money laundering is, but the official definition is that money laundering is the concealment of the origins of illegally obtained money, changing its appearance and nature so that they eventually appear legitimate. So it's exactly what it says on the box. You take some quote unquote dirty money and you insert it into the financial system, and you have it processed in so many ways, in so many places, and on so many different levels that ultimately the original, by default criminal origin, is untraceable and the money is legit. And the reason why people engage and have engaged in this for decades is because in an increasingly interconnected world, we operate less and less with cash. So if you have $1 million or $10 million in cash or more, that's just not how people roll these days. If you wanted to buy a mansion with cash, it is pretty much guaranteed that this would attract scrutiny of so many individuals, a scrutiny that a criminal would want to avoid, which is why you have the whole process of money laundering. And the idea is that you put money from criminal proceeds on one side, you launder it, and it comes out clean on the other side. And obviously, it's not like you put $100 dirty and you get $100 clean dollars. In the end, you put in $100 dirty and you get, 40, 60, 80 clean dollars, probably less than 80. So anti-money laundering is logically the set of activities that are meant to counteract money laundering. So the official definition calls it policies and pieces of legislation that force financial institutions to proactively, important word, monitor, identify, and verify their clients in order to prevent money laundering and corruption. These laws also require financial institutions report any financial crimes and do everything possible to stop them. And this is quite important because that doesn't just rely on the financial institutions' decency or sense of fairness, but if you fail in AML, you can endure really heavy fines, not to mention absolutely disastrous reputational consequences. And if you want to see exactly how horrible things can go, then I suggest you Google something along the lines of Westpac AML fines, and you will see exactly how terribly things have worked out for one of leading Aussie banks, Westpac, which failed to monitor some of its controls, and it turned out that it enabled funneling enormous amounts of money towards pedophile gangs. And it just doesn't get any more horrific than that. So now that we're clear on definitions, let's get to the core of the matter. So let's just get a little bit of the hang of the kind of money we're talking about. So the official estimates, and I'm talking very legitimate of estimates from United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, put money laundering worldwide at $800 billion to $2 trillion per year. So that is about 2 to 3% of global GDP. And at some level, money just becomes a little abstract. You think like, oh, Jeff Bezos is worth like 100 or 150 billion, and it just kind of stops there. So when you hear 800 billion or 2 trillion, that just gets a bit abstract. So 800 billion is roughly equivalent to annual GDP of all of Saudi Arabia. Those are figures for 2018. So a whole wealthy oil state has GDP of 800 billion. Now the upper band, the 2 trillion, is close to the GDP of Italy. So that's again for 2018. So just imagine the global value of laundered money worldwide is somewhere between the annual GDP of Saudi Arabia or Italy, which is just absolutely mind-boggling. And to put this figure further into perspective, the annual GDP of UK is estimated at about 2.8 trillion, and that's for 2018 as well. I suspect that for 2020, the numbers will be substantially lower because COVID, but we're talking about good old days. And the GDP numbers are courtesy of World Bank, so it's the most reliable source there is. So these amounts of money, you sort of run out of adjectives. Like, what do you call them? Exorbitant, unimaginable, incredible. It's just mind-boggling. So and I don't know about you, but I kind of like money. So you would think, oh, money, that's awesome. And how much harm can it be? It's probably all mostly, marijuana or maybe a little bit of cocaine, which should be legalized anyway. And I don't necessarily disagree on the point of whether drugs should or shouldn't be legalized, but this is not how it works. So when you read about the Westpac story, it's just gut-wrenching. It's just absolutely horrendous. So before you think, oh, it's just pot and cocaine, and that's not so terrible, but that's not really the case. That's illegal munitions. That's human trafficking. Mostly into prostitution or indentured servitude. That's trafficking of minors. That is trafficking of endangered species. That is trafficking of ivory. That is illegal firearms sale. That is presumably, although I hope not, some landmine sale. Like every horrible thing you can think of that mankind does, that's part of this 800 billion to 2 trillion. So I love money, but this money just doesn't excite me at all. That's really, really terribly dirty, blood-tainted money. So nothing sexy about that. If you think that it's just some drugs, you are sadly mistaken. So let me introduce you to some of the most complicated financial operations in the world in 30 seconds or less. So money laundering consists of 3 main stages. They're called placement, layering, and integration. So placement is literally when you have some dirty money, presumably in cash, and you just deposit them in a bank. And that's presumably in one of the less strict jurisdictions. You probably wouldn't do it in the UK or Europe. You'd do it someplace where things work a little differently. So this is where the money enters the financial system, which is global and interconnected these days. Then happens something called layering. So this is really the heart of laundering. So that means that the money begins to circulate through schemes that are meant to be intentionally very difficult, very opaque, many, many steps worldwide in order to make this money very, very difficult to trace for somebody who could try, like an investigator or an auditor, because if the money travels 3 stops, then an auditor or an investigator could trace it. But if it travels through 10 or 30, then chances are they might give up or run out of time or run out of money or run out of energy. So this is designed to wear anyone out, to make it untraceable. And obviously none of this happens for free. The criminals will pay very good money for a lot of friendly institutions and some friendly jurisdictions to facilitate for them. And you may have heard some scandals in the recent past, involving some small territories in the middle of the ocean, so to speak, or other republics that are not as strictly governed as the EU. So yes, they are often complicit in these kind of activities. And lastly, you have the final state, which is integration. So this is when the laundering ends and the money comes out of the washing machine and it's quote unquote clean. And this is where once the money is laundered and clean, you can spend it because it has been laundered. So you can legitimately buy assets in the first world. So you can buy, real estate in London, or you can buy yourself a nice car in Italy or whatever. And there is a lot of open questions out there, exactly how much of London's housing market specifically is used, as a haven for laundered money. And the government has introduced some regulations in recent years, like unexplained wealth orders and the requirements for real estate firms to conduct some background checks on their clients. But I don't believe that has been terribly successful. The unexplained worth orders haven't been served very, very many times. And I don't think that we've seen a massive change, which is important because, it's all about changing things for the better. Now, if any of you are sort of thinking, ooh, Bitcoin, then yes, there's also enormous amount of speculation. And I mean, it's pretty much consensus that that cryptocurrencies, chief among them Bitcoin and Ether, are just ideal for money laundering, because you put in real money on one side, then you put it into an asset that is designed to be untraceable, anonymous, decentralized. So there is pretty much a consensus that the meteoric rise in value of Bitcoin and Ether has been fueled to some extent, or maybe to substantial extent, by money laundering activities from criminal activities. So that's something that regulators are thinking quite a lot about. I'm not sure that they've had much success in doing much about it, just because of the very design of cryptocurrencies. So now that I've told you a little bit about money laundering, let me tell you a little bit about anti-money laundering. So anti-money laundering will be a team or a department in a financial institution whose sole task is to stop the criminal money entering the organization. Because you could think that there's a conflict of interest there, that banks or investment managers will welcome money wherever it comes from. Money is money, we might as well take it. But the thing is, there are such harsh punishments, fines these days, administered by the regulators, that it's really not a great business for banks or investment managers to allow laundered money on their balance sheets, because the amount they will pay in fines will be exorbitant. I mean, it goes into billions for 2019. And also let's not forget the reputational fallout. So I've mentioned Westpac, but that's just the high profile example, the most extreme ones. But you also think about a very recent scandal with Danske Bank and a couple other Scandi banks with lax AML control. So these names get exposed to the press, also especially mainstream media, and reputationally it's enormous damage that stays with the company for years. So in short, it's really not great business to accept laundered money for a financial institution anymore. And this is why they have AML teams. So AML teams will perform a lot of compulsory checks on all new clients, and also keep ongoing monitoring of existing clients and their activities. And they will obviously not just guess, they will have dedicated computer systems which will monitor all the activity going on per client. And they will try to generate alerts for the AML analyst to review. Now, that may sound relatively straightforward, and some of the alerts you can think of. It will be, for example, a huge influx of cash. So if I all of a sudden had a cash deposit of £100,000 in my Santander account, that would probably flag up with their AML team. Or if I had huge cash activity overall, deposit 100,000 and then immediately transfer 95,000 and that sort of thing, where there's just a lot of money flowing through my account, but not much of it staying or being spent. Or if I were transferring money a lot back and forth between, I don't know, some of the higher risk countries. So places, for example, like, I don't know, Somalia, or some of the countries that are currently on the sanctions list, or some of the Central American states, or I don't want to drop names in order not to be rude to anyone, but I think you get the idea. Or if my account balance all of a sudden increased from 0 or a minus, which is my default balance, to 200,000 overnight by a single transfer, that would flag up with AML monitoring team as well. So you would think that, okay, so there are all these smart rules, so all the illegitimate activity will be caught, and there's not really that much room for money laundering. But that's not how it works, because most of the AML systems are rules-based. So, for example, a system will trigger an alert when there's a one-off transfer of more than £10,000. I'm just guessing, but you can pretty much reverse engineer those systems quite easily, which means that okay, so next time I'll just get a transfer for 9,500, and no system will pick this up because the rules don't work this way. Or the system will flag up if I have more than 10 international transfers each month. So fine, I'll just have 9, and no one will ever notice me. And there will be other people like myself who are paid to be money launderers, and we'll just do it happily ever after. So the key term, and I suspect Luca will talk about it much, much more, is rules-based. Whenever you have systems that are rules-based, those are the rules that can be reverse engineered, that can be broken, that can be worked around, and that can become ineffective. And I listed a couple of challenges to this in the following slide. So working at AML is really a tough gig, intellectually and otherwise. So first of all, in this function alone, we will have exceptionally high volume of what we call false positives. So, for every 100 alerts that your systems will generate, 85 to 95 of them will be false ones. So, that deposit of 20,000 on my account will be, I don't know, inheritance or bonus, like that. Or, that transfer to Somalia will be legitimate. It will be transferred to my friends who really need the money. And that obscure charity that I donated £5,000 is real. It's just not very well known. So this is an enormous challenge for AML teams and their analysts, because they have to sift through this huge number of alerts, and most of them will be legitimate activity that is not money laundering. But think about all the time and energy it costs to review those alerts. And after that, there is not that much time and energy and mental firepower to investigate the ones that are really suspicious and the one that can be real money laundering. And also think about it from the perspective of purely human resources. If 80 to 90% of the time you are doing something that is legit, and you're not investigating actual money laundering, that it's probably not most efficient operationally. There will be additional operational challenges like data issues, inconsistent regulatory standards, etc. There will be, one final point. There is an imbalance of incentives. So if you are a very, very powerful criminal and you have made enormous amounts of money from criminal activities, imagine the incentive and determination you have to launder this money, as opposed to being an AML department in a regular bank where you are a regular employee who's paid well, but your incentives are sort of professional and moral. You really need to put in a great amount of energy to make sure that you counterbalance the determination of a criminal. And also, the fines for money laundering are so high for financial institutions. I note down some numbers for you. So in 2019, the global AML fines added up to $1.14 billion in 58 cases. And two fines alone exceeded $1 billion. And that was an almost twofold increase on 2018. So AML fines are only on the rise. But despite the fines, despite there being increasingly strong legal frameworks like the EU's anti-money laundering directive, whose version 5 or 6 we're just about to see, the forfeitures of laundered money and laundered assets are just horrifically low. So I've got some figures for the UK. So in 2018, the Met has seized a record of £94 million worth of assets for criminal. You think, well, 94 million, that's a lot. But the estimated total amount of criminal proceeds in the UK in the same year stands between 100 billion and 325 billion. So even taking the more optimistic estimate, the Met seized less than 0.1%. So that also incentivizes the criminals, because they see that statistical chances of their assets being forfeited are so very low. So yeah, the picture is a little mixed and not necessarily optimistic. On one side, you've got all the goodwill, the legislation, and the fines, which incentivize financial institutions to do their best to prevent money laundering. On the other hand, it's just so complex operationally, and the incentives are not always equal for the criminals versus financial institutions. That is just enormously challenging, inherently challenging. So you're kind of looking for, excuse me, for the silver bullet, for something to make this massive, massive positive change. And that's what takes us to the heart of the conversation, which is where AI can help. And fortunately, AI can help in anti-money laundering, and it can help a lot. So, AML is sort of a flagship use case for artificial intelligence in financial services. And that's not by financial institutions, but it's actually by the regulators. Most regulators worldwide have realized and appreciated what kind of a difference AI can make in AML, and they use it as the #1 use case, at least for now. There will undoubtedly be more use cases in the future. So machine learning systems can pre-analyze all the triggers and actually can have a second look at all the data and try to filter the alerts that are false positives and therefore can be snoozed and not investigated, and allow the analysts to focus only on the legitimate alerts. And the great thing about them is that the machine learning systems will be nonlinear and probabilistic. So it will no longer be the case of, there is a rigid rule that transfers above 10,000 are suspicious and below 10,000 are legit. No, it will mean that the system will just observe patterns for individual clients, such as myself, and we'll see that this guy Buczynski just keeps getting transfers in the thousands, and most of this money leaves his account in less than 24 hours. And that's just a bit dodgy. That's not the way normal people operate on their accounts. And this alert might get higher priority with the analysts. Again, when you don't have rules that are rigid, but instead you have something that is nonlinear and probabilistic, that means that these rules, well, there are no rules, so there will be so much more difficult to game and work around, because you no longer have set thresholds, fixed amounts, etc. And Also, when you have the AI system that will help reduce the number of false positives for the analysts, even by half, by pre-sorting, pre-filtering, categorizing, etc., and you can just decide that alerts below a certain threshold of probability can be considered non-criminal, then all of a sudden it leaves your analysts so much more time to properly investigate all those alerts which have a higher probability of being legitimate, like genuinely criminal. And that's just a massive game changer. Imagine that you have a system that helps you save half of the time or more, and you can actually dedicate this time to investigate the alerts which have a higher probability of coming from criminal sources. And let's not forget that machine learning, their fuel is data, and those systems get only better with training data. And financial institutions, especially banks, they just have troves and troves of data. Every single transaction that I have performed in the past 10 years, it's somewhere on file with Santander. So, there's a lot of info about this guy Buczynski, and that's a lot to train an AI on. And my spending patterns have been pretty consistent. I always spend more than I earn. I'm not proud of it, but that's true. So it will be very easy for the system to learn a lot about my income, my spending patterns, where my money goes, etc. And if all of a sudden it changes in a substantial way, it can pick it up without any specific rules put in place. And this is just the beginning, because there are startups out there which only get more and more creative. For example, supplementing real data with supplemented data. And regulators keep a very firm eye on this space, and they very actively encourage AI adoption in this particular field. Normally regulators are sort of technology neutral. That's what they are. But I think that when it comes to AML, they sort of see the potential, and they see how much money is laundered every year, despite the efforts of the police, the regulators, the financial institutions, etc. So they seem to be pretty vocal advocates of trying AI in this field. And on that note, I will end, and I will hand over to Leo for Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wojtek. Yes. Well, thank you. Excellent presentation. It actually made me want to fight money laundering. And if you give me like 10% of possible fines, I'm happy to work with your company, no problem. No, but jokes aside, it's a very, very interesting problem as well. I have to say, I was having the same preconcept of not all money laundering, like being so terrible and tragic as you described. We have some questions. I will start just for simplicity from the Q&A panel, but I also saw something on the chat. So Jose is asking, which step is the hardest one in the money laundering cycle?
Oh, well, it's layering, because this really is the essence of laundering per se. So this is that part whereby criminals are trying their hardest to push the money through so many stops and so many places and shell companies, trusts, and all those weird legal structures in order to make this money essentially impossible to trace.
Cool, thank you. Now, Michael is asking, do you supervise learning for anti-money laundering?
Pardon?
If you use you mentioned artificial intelligence. So Michael is asking if you use mostly supervised learning for this type of task.
I don't think that there is a fixed technological framework. There's a lot of companies out there. Almost all of them are startups, although you have a couple of them becoming a little more established, such as, I don't know, Comply Advantage or Simudyne. And I am not affiliated, I just attended their events in the past. So it's not like there's a set technological paradigm that for AML you use only supervisor and supervised learning. As a matter of fact, I think that these companies have pretty different approaches that they're experimenting with. So I would say that probably for AML it will be a combination of potentially supervised and unsupervised learning, because the systems will probably learn pretty well by themselves, but they need to be slightly pre-trained first.
Yeah, excellent, thank you. And I think Luca is gonna follow on that and give some example of technically how anti-money laundering is performed. So yeah, Michael, just if you wait a 5 minutes, I think you will have a lot of information about it. Then we have a question, one upvote from Kenny. How do regulators feel about using machine learning algorithms, which are less explainable than rules? Because something that I've been told many times for like financial services is very important that whatever decision you make, you'll be able to justify it.
Yes, that is a very good question. And I think that in just about all other areas, the regulators will be really strict and inflexible about explainability, such as, you know, credit cards or credit card limits or any provision of credit or recruitment. It's just such a sensitive area. I think with AML, it's a little bit different. So, you know, any good machine learning system or any good system should have an audit trail and should have a clearly traceable sequence of decisions. So black box is probably not the best idea of good engineering. So as such, those algorithms will probably be explainable, because if these algorithms are not explainable, it's not so much about the regulator, but I as a bank or investment manager will have very little confidence in the vendor. It's like, well, you're giving me a system, but you don't know how it works, and I will not know how it works. It's like, you know, it doesn't sound like a huge advantage for me. So, you know, these systems will mostly use categorization, classifications, clustering, etc. So those are relatively straightforward-ish ML techniques. So they should be explainable. Obviously, they will be trained on the unique data sets that are specific to given financial organization, but they shouldn't be black boxes as such.
Yeah, I think that's a good rule for any machine learning system. So we have another question from Greg. Maybe I'll read these two, and then I will pass it to Luca. So Greg is asking, is money laundering recognized by authorities, for example, the UN, as a major block for global development and therefore deserving more support?
Well, the answer is sort of yes to all of the above. So global authorities and law enforcement and regulators, they don't need to be told the scale or how bad money laundering is. They know it perfectly well themselves. And you would argue that most regulators and law enforcement agencies, especially in the developed world, they certainly have, you know, they have the good will and you know, they want to do the right thing by the law and by ethics, etc. And that, you know, the rest of this question is, I mean, sort of self-explanatory. Is money laundering hampering the global development? Well, of course it is, because all this money, you know, is proceeds of crime. So there is no social good generated out of it. There are no taxes paid on it. Not that I would particularly want to see taxes on human trafficking, but I'd rather just see no human trafficking. But, you know, if this money was obtained legitimately, then there would be no reason to launder it. It would just become part of the system, and there would be taxes paid on it, more or less, depending on, you know, where you are and how good your accountant is. Whereas all these activities are just parasitic, if not worse, on the social level, because it's really difficult to think of any of the activities that result in money laundering that generate any social good. I mean, we could perhaps discuss to what extent drugs registered there, and that perhaps it would be better to have drugs legalized. You know, the Professor David Nutt argument, which I do agree with, but that's just legalizing something that people do already, and so many other activities are just downright horrible. It's the worst of mankind. So therefore, yes, of course, there is no value add. There is value subtracted.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, and maybe a lot of people think about prohibitionism, like in the 20s in the US, as an example of things that maybe should be legalized. But I guess most of it is really things that should not exist. And then we have an industry on top of hiding these activities. So yeah, it feels like there is a lot of wasted resources in terms of human capital, in terms of like victims and so on. Well, thank you, Wojtek. So thank you very much. There is another question about the training process from Michael, but I think we can leave it to Luca if you're fine with it, because it's more related to his talk. Stefan, do you mind if we answer your question after Luca's talk? We can have a final round also with Wojtek, just in sake of time. But thank you very much, Wojtek. It was a great presentation, and thank you all for your interesting questions.
Thank you.
So Luca, now it's your turn. Hi,
Thanks,
Luca. Well, thank you very much. We can follow the same format that we follow with Wojtek. You can introduce yourself. We're probably the best person to do so, and then we're going to go through your presentation. If at any point you have any question, please feel free to write on the Q&A. Sorry, I forgot. Also, there was another question from Wojtek in the chat, but we'll go back to that at the end of Luca's presentation, so he also has time to talk. Yeah, please feel free to use the Q&A. We will read your questions and answer in the same way. Now I'll pass it to you, Luca.
Thanks a lot, Leonardo. So, hi everybody, my name is Luca Primerano. I'm the head of AI at a company called Napier, which is one of the startups that Wojtek mentioned at the beginning. We focus on anti-money laundering and trade compliance within financial institution and big corporate. The idea is that we want to augment traditional rule-based system with machine learning. So the objective of the presentation today is to give you a couple of examples of machine learning, how it's practically implemented to solve some of the problems that Wojtek mentioned in the last few minutes. So I've got 87 slides here and only 12 minutes to talk about. I'm joking. I've got like 10, 12 slides. So usually it takes maybe 20 minutes to go through these slides. What I'm going to try and do is try and keep them to maybe 15 minutes